I always feel it's an embarrassment to give a talk at the Wellcome Trust because I actually have virtually no biology qualifications whatsoever, having started life as a historian. And I think that's that's an important journey, because in the end we are trying to reconstruct history in this. What has happened, and I have had to learn the hard way, is that the way in which we try and learn that history has been transformed completely by the genomic data that now, I think it's fair to say, and I say it with some regret, drives the subject in which we work. And I think every paleoanthropologist has to respond to that. And it drives it very fast. And it's always slightly daunting to give the first talk of a session. On the other hand, it gets it out of the way. However, what I'm pretty sure of, that by the end of the first day, something like 20% of what I say will be wrong. By the end of the second day, something like 50% will be wrong. And I'll end the conference hoping that something I've said at the beginning still holds true. But we'll wait and see whether that is actually going to be the case. Now, what I want to do in this is to talk about, really take on the question of how much the models with which we work on modern human evolution have changed. And for that, we have to go back to deep prehistory, 1987, the annus mirabilis of human evolutionary genetics, when Can et al., we all know Can et al. And the Christmas tree publication came out and introduced us to the idea that humans evolved in Africa with a relatively recent origin. And a pointer? A pointer. Oh, you stole it. Thank you. And the idea of a recent origin and the beginnings of this thing that we all call the out of Africa model. I know there are some other names for it, but we'll stick with the out of Africa model. As a paleoanthropologist, I feel duty-bound to say that actually out of Africa was there before, and we can go back to this paper, this book by W.W. Howells, one of the great figures of anthropology, and this book, The Origins of Modern Humans, both of which, never quite as directly, obviously intimated that we should be looking in Africa for the evolution of modern humans. And so the idea was around, to some extent, as in so often in science, when Wilson et al. Published their paper, it fell on receptive ears. People were keen to grasp this as a new way of thinking about things. And I'll just say in passing, but not say too many things in passing or I'll run out of time, but in passing, just that the revolution was not just the out of Africa, but also the focus on modern human evolution. Because the 60s and 70s were dominated by early hominin evolution, the Pliocene and Pleistocene of Africa. So it really was a sea change in how we thought about things. Now, the mitochondrial DNA, when it came out, was just one part of the story. What it showed was the low level of human genetic diversity or mitochondrial diversity, but that it was much higher in Africa and the inference of an African origin, and that with, as you remember here, entirely sub-Saharan Africans on this branch, suggesting that modern humans evolved in Africa relatively recently from a small population and then dispersed around the world. And this became the out of Africa package. And of course, it's not just a package in terms of mitochondria and genetic diversity. What came with it was the idea of a single and one major dispersal across Eurasia, the spread of humans out, that involved, when modern humans came out, there was no admixture. They replaced the archaic hominids, and I'm going to try not to say there are two models of human evolution, but there's the other one, of course, the multi-regional one. It was suggesting complete replacement and, of course, therefore, extinction of archaic hominids such as Neanderthals. And in addition, it suggested there was a correlation between anatomical and behavioral modernity. This is when the idea of modern humans really came to be discussed widely, and the idea that somewhere after the mitochondrial Eve dispersed out, this new species had all the traits, anatomical, brain size, brain organization, technology, culture, anything else you want to throw in there, and this was an abrupt change in behavior. And what this became, of course, was the human revolution, very popular in the 1987s, of course, the Mellors and Stringer volume, The Human Evolution, and the idea that this package produced humans, in a sense, with one event, origins, dispersals, replacement, and a sort of cultural revolution, modern humans evolved. And it's going to be a very abrupt model. And so with that in mind, we all know, we're all working in this field, we know that there have been major changes in the evidence for this over the past, how many years is it? 87? It's 30 years, isn't it, since then? And we need to try and think a little bit about it. So I want to say, should we now be thinking of a completely different model? Should we be abandoning out of Africa, or is it just a matter of tinkering? In case you're wondering what this symbol is, you can work out that the spanner is to do with tinkering. The axe is an old philosophical problem. This is my grandfather's axe. My father changed the handle and I changed the head, to which philosophers, you can think about this instead of my talk now, is it still my grandfather's axe? And so the question is, has so much changed in the model that we should really start to think in different ways about it? And that's the journey I want to take us on in the course of the next 50 minutes or so. Now, of course, I'm not the first person to start to think that maybe there's more to the out-of-Africa model than the human revolution, and I put here just some of the papers that there have been over the last few years. In fact, going back right to the beginning, I forgot that Marta and I published this paper here, 1992, so that's just a few years out of Africa, already calling it Beyond Out of Africa, reassessing the origins of Homo sapiens. So I think we were first on the block saying, hang on, there's more to this. And I should, at that point, we talked about Marta, say that you only see my name here on the lecture. However, many of the ideas that I'll be talking about are things that, as you probably all know, we've worked on together over many years. What are we going to do? I'm going to do three things in the first instance, or for most of this talk. Firstly, I want to talk about the deeper age for the last common ancestor of modern humans and archaic hominins and what this means. I want to talk about the increasing evidence, what I shall call demographic complexity, the admixture and dispersals, and thirdly, the increasing evidence that we're dealing with asynchronic and mosaic evolution and the way in which this evolves. So I want to run through some ideas about those three topics, and then I'll finish up talking a little bit about some aspects to do with the evolutionary processes underlying it. You might even get a bit of climate in there, just to sort of make the title make sense. So if we go back, just to think back to 87, the out-of-Africa model predicted a relatively recent common ancestor. And although the numbers were vague, people talked in terms of 150,000 to 300,000 for the branching of Neanderthals and modern humans. And this was a very recent origin. The paleontologists at the time tended to think, if they thought at all about this as a divergence, as a single divergence, tended to see a rather older date. So people like Gunther Brauer were talking here about dates of 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 for the divergence. There's quite a revolutionary change in terms of the recency of human evolution. And since that time, there have been a large number of new estimates of the age of the last common ancestor with modern humans. And to sort of pick none of them, this is one that Marta and I did back in 1997 based on archaeological evidence, and we thought somewhere up to 350,000 years was the sort of age. This was the Neanderthal genome paper, sort of range from 700,000 to 370,000. I won't go through all of these. This is an archaeological one, Jean-Jacques Houblin on the paleontological evidence, thinking in terms of about 600,000, and recent work by Mounier and Mirazon-La using a virtual ancestor construction against 700,000. So some are younger, some are older, but broadly speaking, they're all well beyond the original estimates that came out in the human revolution model. So the first thing we have to take on board is that human evolution, modern human evolution, takes longer than we thought it did. Now, that could just be, well, it's just longer time, but we can also think about what that means in terms of the processes and the events. However, in doing so, we also have to think a little bit about what exactly do we mean by the last common ancestor. And I'm not going to talk about last common ancestors with chimpanzees, but the last common ancestor in the discussions with modern humans, of course, originally really meant modern humans and Neanderthals as the divergence, and trying to estimate that age. Now we know following the discovery of the Denisovan genome, that Neanderthals and Denisovans represent sister clades. So there was never a last common ancestor with Neanderthals. There was a last common ancestor with the common ancestor of that archaic lineage, the Eurasian lineage of archaic hominids. And so we would be thinking here of that ancestral point. However, the one that people forget about is this one, which I think is the important one. So we've got some divergence here of modern humans, of the African lineage leading to modern humans, and the one leading to Neanderthals and Denisovans here. But of course, when this lineage parted company, these lineages parted company in Africa, presumably, it was not a modern human. They were archaic Africans. And those archaic Africans are likely to have shared many characteristics here. And so this is perhaps the divergence date that we should really be thinking about in terms of the shift from modern humans. And when does this occur? Well, it's very hard to say, and this is a point at which I make the usual paleontological plea, that the fossil record is very sparse. And it's very sparse in terms of the Middle Pleistocene, the late Middle Pleistocene of Africa, and that there are very few. However, Jean-Jacques Hublin's recent republication of the Jebel Irhoud with new dates and new morphologies has a creature which is very nearly a modern human anatomically, and of course we can compare that with the modern humans that we pick up. That's not actually Homo kibish, but anyway, the Homo kibish specimen at 190,000. Maybe it is Homo kibish. It is. Couldn't see from this angle. At 190,000 years ago. So we can sort of put this last common ancestor here in the 300 to 200,000 year sort of range, anatomically speaking. And then we can think a little bit about what does that mean genomically. Well, of course, the sad answer is we can say very little about it. Now, why does this matter? Why do we really care? Well, we care because when I have to confess, I'm not terribly interested in the genes. I'm interested in what the genes do to produce a phenotype. And it's the phenotype that goes out there and adapts to the environment. Michael referred to my ecological interests. It's phenotypes that adapt, that live, that survive, that undergo natural selection. So what is the phenotype like? So, of course, we want to know what was the phenotype like of humans. And as I said, there are relatively few fossils. And what the genetics can do is they can, by giving us last common ancestral dates, they can rule out certain possible ancestral states. They can say, well, you know, the split is so early, it cannot be anything else, or the split is so late, it cannot be something else. So we can use the relationship there to try and tell us something. And this is where where we need better resolution is, of course, if we have different estimates for different last common ancestors, and I've just put 3 random ones in here at 400, 300, and 600, this would be the sort of early splits here, then amongst these fossils here, we have a whole diversity, and different last common ancestral dates would provide us with different ancestral possible ancestral states, and we would reconstruct the past differently. Now, that's true of both of the phenotype. There are developments. I mean, it's not. So I think this is a challenge for the geneticists to come up with more precise dates of what exactly we mean, particularly within the African lineages, because that's where the action is taking place. That's where modern humans are evolving in the last 500,000 years. But also the new technologies that are appearing that allow us to, I don't do any of this sort of stuff, but Martha and Aurélien in their paper this year, showing that you can start to reconstruct using scanning technologies, using virtual reconstructions to be able to reconstruct the potential ancestors so that we can create new fossils. We can create models of what these phenotypes should be, and then start to compare them with the fossil record. This is not saying what they're like, but they give us hypotheses. I won't read through all this. You've read them all. I'm sure you've read it all through already. But it gives us some idea of where and when and what to look for. And that, I think, is critical. And again, I emphasize this is an African problem. Now, I've talked about the phenotype and the morphology in all this, but of course, it's not just the morphology. I used to try and persuade my students that they had to know every lump and bump on the skull on a human skull, because that's what the essence of being human was. And they quite rightly sort of went to sleep and said, no, what being human about is our behavior. It's language, it's culture, it's symbolic behavior, and it's these things that are critical. So if we move away from thinking anatomical modernity and think just about the evolution of human behavior, we can say we also want to be able to reconstruct that, the ancestral states of that, at the time of the last common ancestor, be it with the Eurasian lineage or be it with this hypothetical African one. So here I've just plotted very crudely what we do know about some of these things that are markers of modernity, and I'm going to park the question of what exactly modernity is. So this is modern humans, and back here at 300,000 years ago, their halfting technology becomes important. They're making blades. Mode 3 technologies are present. Use of ochre, presumably for some sort of decoration of people's skins, shells. There's some functional uses of ochre too, but we'll ignore that for the moment. Ritual behavior of the dead. The Hairto skull, 160,000-year-old, very early modern human. There's a baby skull there which has polish on it, on the skull. And that polish probably came from it being carried around for quite a long time after the creature died. So here we've got, some what I now learned is called thanatology. You can look it up on Google while I'm talking. The processing of the dead in a particular way. We see the marine exploitation and so on. I'm not going to go through all these as being clear markers of modern human behavior. And we can also do the same and look across at the poor benighted Neanderthals and watch them doing absolutely nothing while we evolve our modern behavior. And so I've plotted the same things here. And they have hafting. They use ochre. That's ochre. There's this amazing site in France where there's a cave, and I can't remember the name of it. Bruniquel, where there's this circle of clearly ritually placed things deep inside a cave. And of course, they've got marine exploitation. Some of it's a bit later in terms of date, but it really doesn't matter. This is being argued about to death, these cave art stuff. But anyway, we'll take it for granted. So suddenly, we've got a very different pattern. So if we then say, well, let's put the two together, tell me the difference between the Eurasian lineage of Neanderthals and the modern human lineage of Africans. And we can say, well, that's important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One reason, the one empirically we have to think about is, I come back to ancestral states. If we want to reconstruct the ancestral state, if it turns out all these things here are shared across, as a good cladist, the simplest explanation is that they were present in the last common ancestor. And that puts them into that sort of framework. And the second is this is more to do with Neanderthal extinction. So when modern humans come into Europe and these guys go extinct, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, okay, we'll talk about admixture in a minute, they go extinct, we've tended to assume they go extinct because they were so different from us. And I think a much more interesting and ecologically sound model is to say they went extinct because they were so similar to us. Now, it doesn't mean there were no differences, but we have to think much more comparatively about this whole problem. So I think one of the challenges that here's a table which I haven't filled in because I haven't the slightest idea how to fill it in, but lots of you can start to think how you do it, is this in a sense is our problem. We've got modern humans and their African archaics here, there's the key down here, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and we're trying to construct, in fact, 4 separate ancestral states. Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, well, yeah, 5 ancestral states. And the thing is, we want to be able to fill in here what are these conditions, and then we can start to work out about the evolution of humans across this longer chronology, much longer chronology than Wilson had in mind when he published, when Wilson and Rebecca Cann and Mark Stoneking published the 87 paper, and Chris and Paul were talking about the human revolution. So it's a bit of a game changer in my view. And of course it raises the whole question. I've assumed that if things are shared, they're shared because they're ancestral. Okay, it's a plesiomorphic trait, it's a symplesiomorphy that these features are the common ancestor. Of course, that isn't necessarily the case. You know, bats and birds fly, but it's not, there's never an ancestral trait. And so we have to think how something like mode 3 technologies, and indeed brain size, might have evolved convergently in these 2 lineages, which produces you with an entirely different model. You're saying 2 lineages separated have become that are more and more similar over time. Well, I have my preference, which I'm not going to disclose today, as to which of those models is correct, but we have to take that on as an empirical challenge and think of ways in which we can resolve, as in any evolutionary issue where convergence is at stake, and work out ways of resolving it. So what are the evolutionary implications of this? There are just two I want to emphasize of this deep African roots that I think are important. The first one is here. What I've done is just to plot here the longevity of all the hominin taxa, so just how first appearance date and last appearance data for all the, Australopithecus this and Australopithecus that from the early period. And this is just a fairly typical curve you'd find if you plotted any lineage. And I just put on here where modern humans, as an anatomical species, appears, and we're bang in the middle in terms of the length in which that lineage. If you take the African lineage, this sort of 600,000 year date, then we come one of the longer lineages that persist. So again, I emphasize the importance of bringing in a comparative approach. Think, well, what's happening? Is this typical evolutionary processes going on? So that's my brief consideration of deep African roots and how we have to think about this extended chronology which we didn't think. I've just put this up here for you to read. I won't go through all of them, other than emphasizing the nature of the common ancestor is important. We just have to work out which common ancestor we're talking about. We have to raise the questions of what is the significance of so many shared features between African and Eurasian hominins, and what is derived, what is convergent. And I would ask people, the geneticists, to go out and find us this creature here, the African last common ancestor, the archaics. Now, of course, it's not going to be simple, and it's not going to be simple for the reason that I'll come to in a minute. So, coming to that, how is this a change of, is this a grandfather's axe? Have we just changed the handle, or is this just tinkering? I think I'll leave it to you to think. To my mind, the chronology is the actual length of time takes place does make us think very differently about the processes by which modern humans evolved. The revolutionary model, I don't think, is appropriate in this stage. At this stage. Now, the question about exactly what a last common ancestor is like is made a bit more complicated by the next little section that I want to talk about. There's demographic complexity. When Can et al. Published the glorious mitochondrial DNA, it emerged out of it that there was no admixture. We did not share any mitochondria with Neanderthals when the ancient DNA material came out. And so the suggestion was no admixture, replacement, extinction. And that, of course, is something that has been eroded extensively in the last, I don't know, when the first admixture stuff, 5-10 years, it's been suddenly, it's all the rage to find. And I'm not going to go through these, but many models, arrows joining up branches. As an evolutionary biologist, I hate arrows joining up branches, reticulation, because it complicates life. But quite clearly, it's all going on there. Here's a very beautiful example, Guy Jacobs et al. Published earlier this year. And it's beautiful because it shows two things. One is that the admixture is, there are three admixtures here, the Denisovans and Papuans. But there are three admixtures, not just with three different Papuan populations or different elements of the Papuan population, but three different Denisovan populations. So the dynamics of what is going on across this time, it's not, I draw trees with these big branches, these big trunks of Eurasians. And of course, it wasn't like that. They clearly were themselves diverging and changing over time. So that becomes, so this complexity here. And I'm not, we can spend a lot of time trying to work out how many admixture events there are. But in the end, this is as good a model of human evolution as possible. This is thanks to Luca Pagani et al. I've modified their diagram because I think it's such a beautiful way of presenting. This is the London Underground map of the human evolutionary history, and you take the wrong branch and you're all over the place. But it just stresses that at various points admixture is taking place. And of course, this is only part of it, because of course the closer you come to the present, the more this is going on within our species. And it becomes a critical and important part. So what does this admixture mean for the out of Africa model and the way we're thinking about it? So the first is what I just passed very briefly on this, is scale. I mean, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the way I read this is that there are a number of events which suggests to me that the admixture was not a continuous Eurasian thing. It was Apache. Happened here, happened there, happened at this time, not at that time, with this population, with that population. So if we were to sample across that, let us say, a mythical period, I don't know, 35,000 years ago or something, we'd find a very patchy distribution of genetics. And then over time, because everybody moves around and the modern humans admix even more, it smooths out that distribution. So the scale of our understanding of the admixture is going to vary where you're looking in that quilt, the patchwork quilt of these admixture events. I'm not even going to say anything about this because I don't have time, but just to point out there are adaptive consequences, and there are many things to do with the there are many things to do with the actual phenotypes. Now that we can identify things, there are some areas where it's quite clear there are major differences between Neanderthals and modern humans, where things have been selected against and have disappeared from the human genome, particularly associated with reproduction, and some suggestion with neural things too, so maybe we weren't that identical. But there have also been some suggestions of a more positive selection for Neanderthal features, maintaining them in the population at higher levels than you'd expect, given the initial sort of founder effect nature of the admixtures that went on. So there are consequences of admixture to do with the actual phenotype, defined broadly, and the adaptations, just to bear in mind. But as I am totally incompetent to talk about them, I don't know. Now, the other thing, of course, is important, is admixture and species boundaries. I mean, I was brought up in the days of Homo sapiens covered pretty much everything from Erectus to today. There's glorious archaic sapiens and so on. And it was with great relief Homo sapiens became anatomically modern humans. It was clear Homo neanderthalensis. With all the admixture, one can perhaps say it's time to abandon that and go back to the very generalized Homo sapiens because of this admixture. But I would just caution against this. So you can turn your eyes away at some of these things if you want, but this shouldn't happen in biology. A tiger and a lion, they produce, Mark will remind me, I can never remember ligers and tigrons, what are they called? Ligers and tigrons and things, and they're admixtures. And there's two things I want to make out. So here's lions and here's tigers. Tigers are not the sister species of lions. Leopards are. Okay? So in other words, lions and tigers are hybridizing outside their own family, outside their own lineage, which is probably pretty weird. And so I think this is about a 5-6 million year split. Something like that. That's much, much greater than anything we have to do with Neanderthals. And they produce really weird phenotypes. I mean, look at the size of this creature here. And they're unpredictable. So and different ones, and they're sex-related, whether the lion is the father or the tiger is the father, and so on. And it's highly variable. So there are impacts. Now, I'm not going to go and suggest, because this is happening, these hybrids can be fertile. I'm not going to suggest that lions and tigers and leopards are all one species. I will carry on treating them as separate species. I think we should just use it as a recognition that species boundaries are not necessarily usefully defined in terms of process by Ernst Mayer's definition of what a species is, the biological species concept. It's too static. It's too much at the end of the process for us to worry about. So the second aspect of demographic complexity, if there's so much complexity, is that it's dispersals. It's the fact that different populations are moving around. There's dispersals going on. So remember, the out of Africa model originally suggested one big dispersal, swept the world, kind of a major change. And this paper by Bay et al. And they're saying in particular a multiple dispersal model, perhaps the beginning at the advent of the late Pleistocene, needs to be examined more closely. I have to say, Marta and I treated this with a bit of caution because we wrote a paper in 1994 called Multiple Dispersals and Modern Human Origins, and another one in 98, really emphasizing that there was more and more evidence for multiple dispersals. Now, the genetic evidence has gone backwards and forwards on this, and depending on what day of the week it is, either it's one dispersal or two or three or four. And I think it is now clearly settling down to being a slightly more complex one. Of course, it depends at what scale. If you're just talking out of Africa or versus dispersals within Africa, within Eurasia, once they come out. I think the evidence now is quite clearly that if you take this whole lineage here, this evidence across this is 600,000 years if you can't see it, and this is the climatic wobble, warm to the right, cold to the left. And we can see a whole series of ones for the African lineage coming into Eurasia. This is this ancient DNA suggestion. There was an input of African genes into the early Neanderthals around about 300,000 from the Jena group. Apidema, Katerina Harvati's discovery of a fossil modern human in Greece 210,000 years ago. And it shouldn't be there, according to all the models. We've got Mislaya in Israel, 150,000-ish time. All the Levantine expansions in marine isotope stage 5, 120,000-ish. The new evidence from East Asia are possibly 80,000 plus for further expansions. And Wallacea, I think Chris Clarkson's here. He can decide whether I've got the arrow in the right place for Australia or across into Australia. In other words, early. And then, of course, the big one, the one we all know about, the big Eurasian expansions taking place across this time. So multiple dispersals, I think there is clear evidence. Now, of course, that provides us with a much better basis for understanding the complex pattern, that underground map, the London Underground map of all those interactions, because each one would have brought a different genotype and phenotype and behavior to this pattern. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because once you get into the late Pleistocene, so we're talking after 30,000, and into the Holocene, people are just on the move. I mean, it's just one great big merry-go-round of populations moving in response to the onset of the last glacial maximum as it gets colder and nastier. Movements prompted by lowered sea levels, allowing greater access to certain areas. Movements prompted just because somebody's got a better way of killing a mammoth, and such as the expansion of the Gravettian populations around about 30,000, a bit older than 30,000 years ago, and causing replacements within the Upper Paleolithic or partial replacements. So these dispersals are multiple, and they're very significant in terms of this complexity. And we should perhaps stop thinking about admixtures as such and just think about dispersals and their outcomes from an ecological point of view. And what I just wanted to suggest, this little matrix will help to think about these multiple dispersals and the multiple outcomes. So if you just think there's an indigenous taxon, which in our case, if we're talking about Eurasia, is going to be Africans, and there's a dispersing one. Sorry, did I say Africans? This is going to be Europeans, Eurasians, and this will be dispersing ones. So it can be anything you want, it doesn't matter. And then the indigenous one can survive, be admixed, or go extinct. Okay, we can be more sophisticated about that, but remember, I'm a paleontologist. And we can say the same here. And then we can just think about the outcomes. So fully admixed is full hybridization. You have two populations, they come together, they have a party, and everything is full hybridization. You can get unsuccessful dispersals taking place, an extinction. And I think we should be thinking about all our dispersals in terms of where do they fit into this range of possibilities, this range of models. So we can start with, I think, the big ones, the Eurasian expansions in this sort of time range. There is admixture, but it's basically the assimilation of the native population into the expanding one, because we don't see major, it's not as if the Neanderthals dominate the genome. So they're absorbing in it's not a wipeout. It's not quite out here anymore, the replacement. But we come to other ones. Did anything happen? No, okay. We can have other ones, and perhaps Apidema here, 210,000. Well, maybe the modern humans came in and they died out. It doesn't mean they're there. It was just an early. My undergraduate supervisor, who'd of course been in the war, always used to talk about early modern humans as sending out reconnaissance parties. This is a very military metaphor. So there was a reconnaissance party in his term for modern humans in Eurasia. But anyway, it's an early dispersal which perhaps became extinct. And then On the other hand, there could be other situations where assimilation of dispersing populations, so the presence of these genes, African genes in the early Neanderthals, might be that the modern humans came in, Africans came in, but then they just got absorbed into that population in some way or other. Now this is just the genes. You can play this game with phenotypes and behaviors as well. So this demographic complexity, combined with the extra time we now have on our hands, is a transformation in the model. We don't know whether it's this is just leaky gene flow or genuine dispersals, and that's a major problem, because I think geneticists use dispersals and migration in a very different way from ecologists. It's multiple dispersals, but there are multiple types of dispersals, and there are different outcomes, and these are going to be the challenge to try and work out what is going on. Is this now we now changed the handle and the head in this model? Well, I think certainly it's a bit of a push when the emphasis was on replacement, and it's quite clear that's no longer enough of a model, that we've got so many things going on. So we might be moving more in that direction, because I'm a bit of a gradualist at heart. I still keep the spanner going. I like to tinker around with things. So the third segment of this is this question of what I'm calling asynchronic and mosaic evolution. The out of Africa package, you remember, was revolutionary. It was the human revolution with everything being transformed in one time. And many people, I mean, I don't know if Chris String is here, but he would now, I think, have moved very much away from that revolutionary model to seeing it as a much more continuous process of a longer one. So the chronology, this longer chronology, and this comes out of all the things I've been talking about so far, the dispersals, the admixture. There's just so much going on over such a long period of time. And I think that rules out this upper Paleolithic, this idea of a human revolution. And partly, of course, the human revolution was really trying to apply a European model, the middle to upper Paleolithic transition, to an African problem. Because actually what it confused, the very contrast between the middle and the upper Paleolithic in Europe, confused an evolutionary event with what was actually a replacement event. And the two are very different. So I think the important thing is to get away from that. Now we know, we might do, we know that European record itself has become much more complex. And I'm not going to talk about this partly because I don't know enough about it. And the European record here, let's say the appearance of the Upper Paleolithic, the so-called Upper Paleolithic, is not a synchronous thing. There's all sorts of weird things going on. It's no longer just the organization moving in. You've got a number of different events, spatially and temporally variable. So that is very different. But of course, the African evidence is the key. And this is the sort of the point I want to emphasize, is if you're looking for a big framework in which to look at the evolution of modern humans, it is the African Middle Stone Age. It is the African Middle Stone Age which both the archaic hominins, modern humans, and indeed in terms of technology, the early Eurasian lineages were all using. What do I mean? Because I realize most people are geneticists here. What do I mean by the Middle Stone Age? It comes between the early and the later, is one thing, but it also, so in the lower Stone Age, in the early Stone Age, they were making hand axes, these nice, beautifully shaped, symmetrical objects. But it's beautiful in some ways, but it's relatively simple. You just go around, and if you're skillful, you can make this shape by just following around and knocking the bits off, and it gets closer and closer to the shape. This is really cool, because what they're doing here is they're taking this core, and they're shaping the core. And Chris Clarkson will give a demonstration later on, maybe. He's really good at this. They're shaping the core so that when you want the flake, which is this beautiful point here, you just have to give it one hit, and off comes the flake, already the shape you want. It's a complete, in my view, it's a complete transformation in the way individuals, populations are using technology. We can argue about what's cognitively changed or ecologically changed in driving this, but it's a big one. And what we can say is that it's certainly now with Jebel Irhoud and Oligosyli, this is happening by 300,000 years ago. There's a slightly dubious date, goes back nearly 500,000 years or so, but let's be conservative and say in this phase here, which of course is about the time we see the modern human phenotype appearing as well. So this middle Stone Age is the critical. And again, it's part of this more, if you think the early discussions of out of Africa were focused on what was happening archaeologically 40,000 years ago. We actually should be looking at what was happening 300,000 years ago. So this is the kind of pulling it all together and say, well, if we think now of what we've been talking about, we've got 800,000 years of time to play with. We, broadly speaking, have an African lineage, and we have a Eurasian lineage. The Eurasian lineage divides into Denisovans and Neanderthals, and who knows who else might be out there that we need to think of. And the Denisovans and Neanderthals themselves divide up, and I've put a little variation in there. The African lineage, we've got the modern, we know very little about where you're getting a divergence of the African archaics, and of course, we have all this admixture. And then plotted onto here, I've just put, red is a behavioral change, which I mean archaeological evidence for behavioral changes. Green is morphological, so it's the appearance of anatomically modern humans and shifts going on in morphology. Blue is dispersals. I would now add a lot more to this diagram probably, but we can fill it in as we feel fit. And then extinction is when things disappear. Nice, good black. So across this, and this is a minimalist view of the complexity of the last 500,000 years to 1 million years in terms of evolution. And then the greens are the admixtures that are taking place. So it just means that that's the framework. It's a much more population-based and multifaceted approach that we have to think about for this. So if we look at those three things, we end up with this idea of what I'm going to call the extended out of Africa. We don't need a new name or anything, and it really emphasizes the multiple events across different domains in the phenotype, the genotype, and what I'm calling the extended phenotype as behavior. It involves mosaic evolution, not a synchronic horizon of change across these, and it involves complex demography driven by dispersals and biogeography. So I think that's where we should be thinking. Now, if I have 5 more minutes to... 15 minutes. I haven't got 15 minutes left to say. Our time for questions. Okay. So if I have got time, which seems I do, what I want to do is to finish off by saying, okay, let's step a little back from this and stop thinking this solely in terms of the evolution of modern humans. Let's put on our evolutionary biology hats and think, well, what actually is driving evolution in general? And so I want to talk about 2 or 3 things here about this, starting with phenotypes, genotypes, and so on. So this is my little cartoon that summarizes all evolutionary potential. And you can say, well, evolutionary change takes place because you get a change in the genome and an isolation of populations, and that you get the cladogenesis, the speciation taking place through allopatry or whatever. New context produces a new phenotype, and that new phenotype invents a new behavior, or behavior. However, you could have a model in which you get a new phenotype evolving, they think up a new tool, and then that gives all sorts of opportunities. They spread, they allopatrically separate, and the genes and the population dynamics follow on from that. Or we can come down here, there's lots of possibilities, and we say, perhaps it starts with the behavior. You change in behavior, and this produces, you can put this in whatever order you want, this produces either new behaviors with new geographical distributions, and so allopatry and separation and competition between groups, and a new phenotype. Now, this last of these is actually referred to generally, or a lot of people refer to it as the Baldwin effect. My former colleague, late colleague Pat Bateson, called it the adaptability drive. The idea is that actually evolutionary change is more likely to start with behaviors. So I always use the example of bipedalism. Some ape ends up trying to be bipedal because it's got to walk between trees, and those who can do it better, who have that behavior rather better, end up, because those individuals who can do it slightly better because they've got the phenotype. So the behavior drives the phenotype. So it goes in that direction. And I think when if we went back to that diagram I had, we want to start to look at what is the relationship between the behavioral changes we're seeing and the anatomical changes, and can we use the genes in any way to map out what is going on? As a behavioral ecologist at heart, I tend to think it's the behaviors change first, and the morphologies are following on from that. But I could be completely wrong. We have no a priori reason for thinking it might be one rather than the other. But I think that is a big challenge. The other thing we need to think about is species and speciation. I've talked about species in terms of species boundaries and admixture. And part of the problem comes because we think of speciation as an event. We've all read our books on the speciation event. And what Marta and I have been working on for many years now is to rethink a bit the speciation process. Now, there are numerous definitions of species, numerous ways of thinking about species, and what we've tried to do here is to say, well, actually, all the different species concepts, we have Simpson's evolutionary species. Species is just something evolving independently. We have Craycraft and Eldridge and people's phylogenetic one. A species is something that has something different about it. It has apomorphies. To Patterson's species mate recognition, it's a different species if it has sex in a different way. He didn't put it quite like that, but in other words, it's the sexual selection, it's the reproductive selection motors. Lee Van Valen's model, an ecological species, it's a new species when it's doing something different. And he doesn't care about what it looks like or anything. If it's ecologically different, it's a separate species. And then we have the mummy and daddy of them all, Ernst Mayer's biological species. It's a species when it's genetically isolated, when it cannot interbreed. And what I think what we want to try and think about is that these are not alternatives. They are just thresholds on the way of speciation. So allopatry, separating out, geographical separation is at the base of it all. As that happens, you get phenotypic or behavioral differences, establishment of specific mating, different mating, or ecological differences come in. And only at the very end of this process do you get genetic separation. So part of the argument here is that actually, by the time you get true, and this is talking about mammals here, I should emphasize, I think all sorts of other things go on with different species, once you get into the weird and wonderful world of insects and plants you can forget about, in a way, the really exciting evolutionary biology is taking place prior to that. And so when we think about modern human evolution, and we've seen this model, so I've now got rid of the big, this idea that it's a monolithic branch, and it's just lots of populations fragmenting, joining up, reticulating, diverging, becoming extinct, dying out, and in the process they're passing through these thresholds. So the Simpson threshold, allopatry here, and early in the Eurasian branching processes, they become separated allopatrically. Over time, they may or may not establish the different ecological differences or reproductive differences. And the point is that by the time modern humans and Neanderthals meet, so I have to look down here because I can't read the one up there. What date have I got? I've got meeting after somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago. Probably all these thresholds have been passed, but not full genetic isolation. So you can then, depending on your taste, you can come back and say, well, they're not separate species because they haven't passed the final test. They haven't done their PhD in genetic in speciation process. They've only got sort of GCSEs at the early stages. Or you can say, no, I think for all intents and purposes, we have watched a speciation process going on. And I'll say in passing, it's probably the best documented mammalian speciation known because we actually know the behavior. But that's a sideline of mine. I go on about that in other contexts. And then, just to sort of wrap this up, it reminds us that actually something that Marta and I have talked about a lot, evolutionary geography or biogeography, that we always define evolution as change through time, but it starts geographically. It's the distribution of populations in space that is so critical. And that's important. And we've seen, I think, there's been a lot of focus on that. And I think geneticists need to come to grips with this problem. I mean, this paper came out this week. We all evolved in the Okavango swamp or in northern Botswana or something, based on the distribution of living populations there today. Well, we've got 200,000 years for them to wander around Africa before we start saying things like that. Or we could have Elie Skerry and colleagues' view that of a kind of multi-regional Pan-African knowledge. And I think what we actually need to go back to is our basic evolutionary biology, that populations start in small areas and they expand, they disperse. They may or may not admix, and clearly the African ones were gathering in other African populations as they did so, but that's the model we need to think of. We need to think of it at different scales. And that's what it's geographical distributions that will ultimately generate our phylogeny. But the genetics cannot pinpoint those in the past because people move. And just, this is, again, Marta and I love showing this one, just to remind you that saying that humans evolved in Africa doesn't mean very much at all. It's just saying we didn't evolve in the New World. Because Africa can take in Europe, the whole of Asia, the whole of China can all fit into Africa, and you've certainly still got room for Belgium and other places in that area. It's a vast area, so it is an issue where within that we evolved. And I think this is my last substantive slide, and just to say climate change comes in. I've been talking about, I chose the title really to talk about climate. It's the climate of thinking that we're interested in. It's changing the way we think about out of Africa and about modern human origins. It might be making it a more pluralistic and integrated with broader branches of evolutionary biology than the ones which we all specialize in. We have to specialize, but we have to think that out. But the second element of climate is that there's a lot of climate out there, climate change across this period, all these oscillations. And if we think of these events, there's not going to be a simple story saying, when it's warm, they do this. We're going to find all sorts of funny interactions, different ones between dispersals and climate from dispersals and behavior. Extinction is going to relate differently. So we have to start to think how to plot those in to get the climate models, and I've worked with climate models and had some sort of broad models and things. I think we have to be much more specific to think about what parameters of climate are changing what parameters of the human demography and the human evolutionary change. And it's just not, it's not national, it's not a global problem. This is just an East African one. There are regional patterns, so asynchrony is likely to be a significant pattern. And not just that, it's scale. So this is just showing the scale of the one I just showed you, the big major oscillations. This is just picking out, what's this, for 50,000 years. Just in South Africa, this is Jacobs and Roberts. Some people have questioned these dates, but it doesn't matter for the point I'm taking, is that these are oscillations occurring over a 10,000 year period. So getting the scale right is absolutely critical in all this. So where are we left? I won't summarize this in any detail because I've gone through most of it already. The case I want to make is that there's a bit of tinkering. There's quite a lot of grandfather's acts about this, and we have changed the handle and we have changed the head. But my philosophical conundrum that I presented you with at the beginning, I'd say it's still my grandfather's acts, despite that. And that we keep this out of Africa. But we have to think much more flexibly and broadly about the processes that are involved, and some of the issues that we need to look at are outlined there. And just to make your life a little bit more difficult, just to remind you that modern human origins, and I'm a paleoanthropologist, and I probably worked most of my career, a lot of it, on much earlier period. This is just the tip of the iceberg, chaps. We need to get there deeper back in time and deal with some of the real problems of 25 other taxa of hominins out there for us to understand these processes. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Very thought-provoking talk. So since we have time, I have two questions, very different ones. The first is concerning this cultural phenotype of the Eurasian lineage, the Neanderthals. Is it kind of really now generally accepted that, let's say, symbolic burials, that the Neanderthals had that? Because kind of recently, at least it sounded like there was a lot of discussion around that.
There is discussion. I mean, nothing, in my field, probably yours too, nothing is ever, the way I think it is. People will argue. But I think there's, I will give a very simple example. The only population we have a knowledge of anything down below the neck, regularly skeletons, is Neanderthals. And it must be because they buried their dead. No other hominin, most hominins leave us scraps of teeth and skull and the odd bone. We've got so many full skeletons, they must be doing something. Now, whether they're doing it to keep the hyenas out or, because they love their mother and father, I have no idea. I mean, it's quite interesting that there's, in comparative thanatology, it's clear chimpanzees take a lot of interest in dead bodies. Other animals do. So I personally don't have a problem with that.
So, and kind of the second question, I guess it's less concrete, really. So, what you said about kind of phenotype first and the genotype later, or behavioral phenotype first. I think the problem what I have with this is that in evolution, for evolution to happen, you need to pass from generation to generation information. And in fact, for complex evolution, lots of information. So once we have the human language, then cultural evolution can start for real because we pass lots of information through language. But what's the mechanism before the human language to pass more than just a few bits from generation to generation?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of work on sort of cultural evolutionary models too. I mean, if I just go back to the chimpanzees, they obviously do transmit social information. They're not very good at it because things die out. On the other hand, our early, if you look at something like a hand axe, I mean, that, assuming there's not a gene for making a hand axe, there's enormous continuity there. My guess is they wouldn't have had language like us. So I think that's, to me, that's not a problem. And we know animals do pass on traditions over periods of time. The replicability. I mean, I think in a way that I have more of a problem just saying, well, the idea of a mutation coming along at the right time, I find very strange, and it's much more likely that changes in behavior expose standing variation that's already there to selection, and therefore they become favored. And then so that these small behavioral shifts, and I'm not talking about big things, they're just small behavioral shifts in how you distribute yourself across the landscape, have a knock-on effect in across the whole of the biology of the organism.
I think it's quite controversial, and I guess the kind of counter-argument is that before the human language, what you can pass on in other ways than polymer molecules actually is very, very few bits, really. And but they may be important bits, of course, so that's the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very nice talk. I just have a comment about the genetic divergent states and sort of the need for geneticists to provide like certain dates for the archaeology or the paleontology to fit certain fossils to or not. I think, and the other geneticists can also jump in, I think we should start to try to get away from these very specific divergent states, because we now the mitochondria has a specific divergent state of, say, 200,000. The Y chromosome goes back to 400,000. And then I think we're going to have various loci across the genome that are very different ancestors across the African continent that will go back to many different times. So we're going to have like a range of dates with many different ancestors across the African continent, and there won't be one specific time that we can really provide from the genetic side to say, this is where our species first diverged.
No, it's a good point, and I certainly didn't. I mean, I take the point that for every gene there's going to be a different divergent state. I mean, some will predate probably the hominin lineage, and so I'm aware of that. I think what I'm as a user of this information, what I really want to know is when is there an effective demographic divergence taking place, and what is the best signal of that? And we all now say, well, mitochondria, for example, are not a good signal of that in the way we thought it was. Perhaps clearly the whole genomes approach is in some ways, but it gives us a very blurry picture. So, the challenge is to turn, as it were, from single genes giving us or single loci giving us, a billion different answers, to having just one answer. We want splits that relate, or split times that relate to particular questions. My questions are on the whole evolutionary and geographical and demographic. So I shouldn't say this in this audience. So the actual history of a particular gene doesn't interest me as much as the signal, the demographic signal it's giving me.
Yeah, but I think it is because this blurry picture then that emerges is probably close to what actually happened.
No, I mean, I'm not saying it happened on October the 29th, 30th, whatever day we are, 4,004 years ago. It's not. It's not. I mean, no one's suggesting that. I know there's going to be a range, but I think we can still, in trying to reconstruct evolutionary history, see that as a goal.
Yes. But I also think that what you see in paleontology and what we see in genetics is kind of overlapping, because you see these various places in Africa, this idea of the multi-regional origin, and these various morphological forms evolving in different places in Africa. While we see the similar kind of picture, I mean, different loci in people have different histories, and they might trace back to different parts of Africa. And I'm going to talk also more about this in my talk on Friday. But I think, I mean, we are kind of seeing the similar picture.
Yeah, I mean, no, we are. I mean, I personally, I think our fossil record is so bad at the moment in Africa. We just need more. It's very difficult to say what is evolving where in this period. I mean, we can do, you know, the origins of modern humans compared to Heidelbergensis, but we can't do the texture because the fossils aren't there.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Following on from Karina's point, I think what she wanted to say is that genetically, and given, you know, the second half of your talk, there may not be such a demographic event to pinpoint, but I think the question is there anything in the fossil record that suggests otherwise, that we cannot think of, you know, middle to late Pleistocene Africa as the place and time for kind of human origins? And is there anything in the archaeological record that suggests that we can go more kind of narrow geographically or temporally than that?
Well, I suppose in the archaeological record, I would say, you know, that the evidence for the earliest Middle Stone Age is strongest in East Africa, and I think that's where we kind of expect it. How much we can, you know, so I think I expect us to be able to refine it down to that sort of level. At the moment, I don't think we can with the fossils because we just don't really have enough of them to say, you know, there's these different regions. And bear in mind also how, and I showed the climatics, how dynamic these things are. So what we call East Africa, we forget about it as East Africa and think about it as a type of environment. It goes all the way up deep into North Africa at certain times, and other times it's constricted to small areas. So we would struggle to do that. But I would, you know, I think we can, and we certainly should be aiming to pinpoint it, you know, more closely. Because I said, you know, saying we evolved in Africa is not saying very much.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Great talk, by the way. Just, I don't know, a comment. So from genetics, now we are all ready to embrace the concept of admixture, right? The idea that different lineages cannot mix. But from cultural and behavioral perspective, we still seem to think in a very, you know, cladistic way. I don't know, like, you know, you made a point of convergence versus common ancestor. What about cultural admixture, interaction? For example, we have this, at least in your final slide, well, penultimate, there was a model of maybe African sapiens Neanderthal interaction 300,000 years ago, and then all of a sudden Neanderthal behavioral change, red block, and sapiens behavioral change, red block. Well, maybe it was interaction.
Yeah, and it could easily, and thank you for the diagram, by the way, which
It was mostly Mike Mespalu's artwork.
It's a good diagram. Yes, okay, yes, we do need to. I have to say, I tend to sort of do a lot of tree building in archaeological things because on the whole, archaeologists are very reluctant to think. I mean, they actually, I probably do not represent the field terribly well because I think they would be much more in line saying, well, it's all kind of, you know, flowing together. And clearly information is flowing. I mean, the Châtelperronian, the acculturation of late Neanderthals, I saw there was a paper earlier this month, you know, saying that actually, you know, none of the chronology makes any sense for that. So, you know, we don't know. I think the real problem is just think, acculturation, if we understand it as taking place, is likely to occur over a period of hundreds or thousands of years, max, okay? If I could, you know, the sort of information we have, we're lucky if we put it into 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 year brackets. So trying to then pick up what might be acculturation versus, I'm talking about Africa here in terms of the time scale, versus what might be a dispersal is going to be very, very difficult to do. I mean, I agree we should, and you're absolutely right. The flow of traits, you know, should go in. I mean, in terms of, you know, just to come on the genetic admixture side of things, I mean, you know, we all emphasize it, but sometimes we forget the fact how small it is. You know, it's not a big, you know, again, in generation one, it must have been massive. However, the actual overall impact was very small on humans. Most of human genes come from that African ancestry. So ask the same question about cultural things. It might be that a few things are dribbling across, but is the bulk of cultural transmission done through phylogenesis rather than horizontal transfer? I mean, linguists are, make the same sort of discussions about things. I mean, I would say these are the major questions we should be addressing in the next 10 years or so, or you should be addressing in the next 10 years or so.
Right, that's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.